My name is Rachel. It's a pleasure to meet you on the virtual world of Zoom. I am a forest pathologist at the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. I'm based out of Olympia, Washington, but we do cover the entire state. So don't be shy. Feel free to write down my contact information and reach out after this talk if you have any more specific questions I can't get to. So today I'm going to be talking about Western Washington forest health. It's a pretty broad topic for such a short talk. So I'm going to start with some background information, jump into some specific examples, and then end by pointing you towards a bunch of resources that you can learn more on, because I certainly can't cover everything that's happening in our forest here in Western Washington. So to begin with, I want everyone to take a moment and consider the difference between tree health and forest health. To start with, the landowner objectives are often very different. If you're considering just a single tree, you're often thinking about such things as safety, is the tree going to fall, or aesthetics, or how well does it produce shade, and those sort of questions. If we're looking at an entire forest and considering its health and our objectives from the forest, we're thinking about, say, timber production, or maybe wild habitat creation, or even fire mitigation, to name a few things. And with these different objectives come different definitions of a healthy forest. So if you ask me today what a healthy forest looks like, my answer will be it depends. And it depends because a healthy forest is a forest that provides the desired services and products of that landowner and land managers. In addition to that, not only does it provide those services and products, it does that while being resilient to disturbances, meaning in the face of stressors, it can still provide those services and products. And there are certainly a lot of things out there that can impact a single tree and in larger scales an entire forest. Here I've listed a bunch of what I'm calling disturbance agents for this talk, which are either abiotic or non-living, or biotic or living things that can impact a single tree. They range dramatically from everything from mechanical damage to temperature and moisture extremes, low oxygen, nutrient imbalances, soil pH, air pollution, and herbicides, all on the abiotic side, to name a few. And then on the biotic side, or the living side, we have everything from viruses, bacteria, fungi, parasitic plants, nematodes, insects, and other such living organisms that can impact a tree. So this is just a reminder that a lot can happen to an individual tree and also to a large forest. So what do these disturbance agents actually result in? Well, in most scenarios, they cause lots of positive impacts. And this is an important thing to remember, especially when I'm about to talk about a lot of ways a tree can die. So keep this in the back of your mind, that these disturbance agents can help a forest become healthier by providing natural thinning. In other words, they take out some of the weaker trees, giving more space and resources to other trees to grow and thrive. They also provide a lot of wildlife habitat. Our biologist here at DNR loves to remind us that 40% of our wildlife species depend on dead trees at some point. So those are an important part of a healthy forest. And also they help create diverse forests. This is both in terms of structure, where we have young and old trees and dense and not dense areas, but also in terms of species, where different species like different conditions to thrive in. But of course, this is usually what we think about when we talk about disturbance agents, all the negative impacts. And it's true. This is especially true for anything that's non-native impacting our forest, or any disturbance agents that have been exaggerated by climate change or human impact that are just impacting our forests at much larger scales than normally would be expected. And of course, in these cases, we have everything from economic and to ecosystem costs. This might be a reduction in timber value. It might be paying for hazard trees to be removed. It might be reducing wildlife habitat or erosion control, just to name a few things. So what are these disturbance agents actually doing to an individual tree? Well, there's only so many ways that disturbance agents can impact trees, and that's because trees only produce symptoms that can manifest themselves in 3 different ways. They either cause the underdevelopment, overdevelopment, or necrosis, meaning death, of tissues, organs, or portions of the plant. And that means that there's a limited number of ways a tree can respond to a certain disturbance agent. So you can think of it similar to a fever in humans not being unique to a specific sickness. But it's a little bit more complicated than just thinking about disturbance agents on a specific tree cause symptoms. So in forest pathology, we like to think about the disease triangle instead to make sure that we are considering the full picture when we're out in the field. And this triangle just reminds us that there are three things that are needed for disease or symptoms, in other words, to develop on a tree. And those three things are represented by each side of this triangle. You have the agent, which is often a pathogen or pest on one side. We've been calling this a disturbance agent. You have the host, in this case, a tree, on the other side. And that's usually what people think of. But the third side, the environment, is also often important when it comes to forest health. So to show you an example of this, we're going to look at the disease Swiss needle cast, which is a foliar disease that's caused by the disturbance agent Nothofeocryptopus guamani. This is a fungus, and the fungus only impacts its host, the Douglas fir. However, everywhere the Douglas fir is, you will find this fungus, but not everywhere will you find this disease. And that's because you also need to consider the environment. The environment with Swiss needle cast to develop needs moist, cool springs. And that's why we typically only see impact from this disease along the coast of Washington state. And you can see in the picture here, what happens is the fungus produces fruiting structures in the stomates on the underside of the needle, causing the needles to prematurely shed and therefore reduce the growth of these Douglas fir trees in our coastal forests. So moving on to some more specific examples, I would like to talk about the most important disturbance agent here in Western Washington. So what is that? Well, the most important disturbance agent here is whatever is impacting you in your backyard and impacting your landowner objectives. So unfortunately, I will not be able to cover all of that, and I probably don't have the answer to know what's in everyone's backyard. But I'm going to spend the rest of this talk talking about three examples that I think we'll all come across if we're spending any time in Western Washington forests. And then hopefully end with some resources that you can dive in deeper for other topics that I didn't get to. So we're going to spend a lot of time in root rots. These are prevalent in our forests in Western Washington, but often overlooked. And then we'll touch on bark beetles as they often come up, and then end with some drought and heat discussion. So first off, moving on to root rot diseases. This is a category of diseases that cause exactly what they sound like they cause. They cause decay in roots, in other words, rot in roots of trees. These are caused by fungi or fungi-like organisms. And the important thing to remember here are the ones that are impacting our native forests in Washington state are native and part of our natural forest system. So what you can see pictured here is, I'm sorry if you can see my screen there. What you can see here is decayed roots of a tree that has been impacted in root rot diseased, that has root rot disease on its roots, and you can really see how there's no roots left to this tree that's fallen over. And you can compare that to this healthy tree that has fallen over for other reasons, and showing you how extensive a tree's root system actually is. So if you have root rot in your forest, what do you actually see at sort of a stand level and sort of a large scale? Well, you'll notice a couple of different things if you have root rot present. The first thing you often notice is that you'll have pockets of symptomatic trees where they're all clustered together. Then within that pocket, you will notice that there's several stages of slowly declining trees. This might be a tree that's not looking so good, a tree that's recently dead, a tree that has been dead for a very long time, and so forth. Additionally, any trees that have fallen over, which is common when your roots rot, will be in a jacksaw pattern, meaning that they're pointing in every which direction and not all in one direction, such as what you would see if there was a wind event. And then lastly, in that sort of area where the trees are declining, you often will see regeneration of other species, especially hardwoods, or even young susceptible species growing into that disturbance area. Now, if you're seeing things like this at a stand level, you then want to look closer at your individual trees in the area for specific root rot tree symptoms. Now, of course, the main thing you're looking for is rot or decay in that root or butt region of the tree, so that lower portion of the stem. But there's a couple other things that you can also come across in these areas. The first thing you might notice, and this depends on tree species and root disease, is you might see some resinosis on the root collar, meaning sap produced at the very base of the tree. You may also look up if the tree is still alive and notice that it's not looking too good, that it's thin and discolored. And this thinning happens from the bottom of the ground to the top of the tree and the inside of the tree to the outside, which is the opposite of a couple other things we'll talk about later. You also can look up to the very top of the tree to assess how well the tree has been growing recently, because often trees with root rot diseases have reduced growth. Now, the easiest way to do this is to look at that very center leader branch in the very center of the top of the tree and see how much it's been growing in the last few years. If you have reduced growth, like pictured here in this photograph, you have a sort of rounded top where that center part of the tree isn't putting on much growth. And this is compared to a typical pointy Christmas tree where the tree is growing well. You may also find distressed cone crops are being produced on these trees. These are a little hard to identify, but the cones tend to be smaller and not as viable as a normal cone crop. And then lastly, you may come across some secondary bark beetle activity, and we'll talk about bark beetles after root rots and go more into that. So once you think you have a root rot impacting your property, the next thing you want to do is to identify what specific species of root rot do you have present. And to do this, you take two steps. The first step is you want to determine which tree species are being impacted. So walk around your forest and pay attention in that sort of pocket of decline of what trees are actually being killed. And that's because different root rot diseases impact different tree species differently and have different preferences of which they will kill and can kill. So once you figure out which tree species are being impacted, you go to a chart such as this one here, and this is just a subset of a full chart that I'll point you to at the end of this talk. And you can reference what tree is being impacted and see the likelihood of what disease is being impacted, is present on your tree. And this helps you narrow down what root rot you may be dealing with. The next thing you want to do is you want to get a little dirty out in the field and examine those roots for rot and for fungi. And this is the fun part. This is where you pull up young trees that have died, you hack into any of the roots that have been overturned, and you even dig into the base of dead standing trees to hack into the roots. So anything from a plasky, which is what we typically use, to a shovel, a spade, and an axe can do the job at this level. So what you're doing here is you're looking for signs of rot and for fungi in these roots. And so I'm going to show you sort of some close-up pictures of what you would find for some of our most common root rots you'd find in Western Washington. I'll touch on three. There are some more, but these are the ones you're most likely to run into. So if you're looking at closely at some trees that are impacted by the root disease, laminated root rot, you will notice in older areas of decay that there's a delamination occurring, meaning that the layers of the tree that are put on every year, those tree rings, are coming apart into separate sheets of wood. When you see this, you can start looking more closely. And once you know what you're looking for, and this one's a little tricky, you can notice that there may be areas of acetyl hyphae produced on this wood. With your naked eye, this can look very faint, like sort of like peach fuzz. But if you use a hand lens or another way to magnify what you're looking at, you will notice that it's sort of like brown, red hairs that are growing on the wood. And when you see this, this is pretty diagnostic to laminated root rot, and you know what's present. Additionally, when you're digging into the soil to look at the roots that are not yet exposed, you often come across ectotrophic mycelium. That's a fancy way just to say sort of white fungal growth on the surface of these roots. And then lastly, with laminated root rot, you may come across their fruiting structure. These are brown crusts that are hard to identify just because they often look just like dirt on the tree. And they're uncommon, so they're not usually used to identify laminated root rot, but something you might come across in the field. Now, what you're seeing here is different if you're seeing an area with trees impacted by armillaria root rot. This is another fungus that causes root disease. Armillaria root rot, just like laminated root rot, causes a white rot, but you don't see any delamination in the decay. The thing that you mostly see with armillaria root rot, and the best way to identify it, is when you cut into the bark of the roots or the base of the tree and peel away the bark, you often see this layer of thick white mycelial growth, or in sort of a fan shape, between the bark and the sapwood of the tree. This sort of looks like thick white latex paint that has been applied between the two layers. And you can often even like peel it off with your hands, and it should be pretty thick in your between your fingers. And that's because there are other species of armillaria fungi out there that don't kill trees, but do take advantage of dead trees and grow in there. So you're really looking for a thick white mycelial fan between the bark and the wood of the tree. A couple other things you might come across with armillaria root rot are black rhizomorphs. This is another type of fungal structure, the black rhizomorphs, that often look like sort of thick shoestring-like structures that again grow between the bark and the wood of a tree. And then rarely you'll come across brown mushrooms. These honey mushrooms are produced only for a short time period and are not produced on every single tree with armillaria root rot. And they can look like other species of mushrooms out there in the woods. So they're not often used for diagnosis because of that, but it is something you might come across. And then the last root rot disease we'll talk about, what we'll see if we dig into the rotted stumps and the roots in the area of root rot pocket, is for heterobasidian root rot or anosis root rot. You may see an advanced decay, delamination, so similar to laminated. But for the most part, you'll see stringy white rot. And this stringy white rot, if you look closely, can often have black flecks sort of incorporated within the rot. In photographs, it tends just to look like dirt on the wood, but in person, you can actually see those black specks are part of the rot itself. And that's a good indication that you're dealing with heterobasidian root rot. And then lastly, and rarely, you will come across heterobasidian conchs. These conchs are not always produced, and when they are, they tend to be produced underneath the needle layer on the soil or in cavities within old stumps. So they're hard to find. And also know that there's lots of other fungi that produce different types of conchs out there. So you also have to be able to identify your conchs to use this as identification. But just in case you do stumble across something like that, that can be a good way to ID heterobasidian root rot in a specific area. So why do we care which root rot we have on our property? We care because they have all slightly different root rot life cycles. And I'll quickly go through all of them, though you'll notice they all have some very common trends. Starting with laminated root rot, which is the first root rot disease we looked at. Here's a diagram of how it spreads. Its main means of spread is in the soil between trees using root-to-root contact. This is a slow process, moving just a couple feet a year from infected or dead trees to neighboring healthy trees. And that explains why we see these pockets of symptomatic trees and trees that have been recently killed versus those that are just being impacted in one area. Additionally, it is important to know that laminated root rot, like the other root rots, survive for very long periods of time, decades even, in the decaying stumps and roots of symptomatic and dead trees. That's why when you think about root rots, you often consider them diseases of the site instead of diseases of the tree, because they just are there for such long periods of time. And now I did mention laminated root rot does produce a fruiting body, that brown crust, that does produce airborne spores, but it is not known how those spores impact the spread or dissemination of this root rot, so it's not included in this diagram here. Now we'll compare this to armillaria root rot. Again, armillaria root rot is very similar to laminated root rot. The main means of spread, as indicated by the curved arrows, are between root-to-root contacts, between symptomatic trees to neighboring healthy trees. And just like laminated root rot, it can survive for long periods of time in the soil as well, in those rotting roots and stump material. Unlike laminated root rot, its fruiting bodies, those mushrooms, those honey mushrooms I pointed out, do produce airborne spores, and these have been known to infect other areas farther away from the root pocket. This does not happen often, so it is not often really considered in forest management, but has been known to occur before. And then lastly, armillaria root rot is the pathogen that produces those black rhizomorphs, those sort of shoestring structures I mentioned. And the unique thing about those structures are that they are capable of growing for short distances outside of host material, and they can connect, sort of bridge the gap between two trees that have yet to have root-to-root contact, as shown by that straight arrow on the right side, just sort of increasing the range of armillaria root rot. And then lastly, heterobasidian root rot, again, very similar to the first two in the sense that it moves mainly between trees through root-to-root contact slowly over many years, and that it survives for long periods of time in the decaying stumps and roots in the ground in these areas. The one additional piece of information for heterobasidian root rot is that the hard to see conchs that it produces does produce airborne spores. These airborne spores are known to infect freshly cut stumps in other areas, to the point where there are some places in the world where they put pesticide, some fungicide, on the surface of freshly cut stumps to limit the likelihood that heterobasidian can infect a freshly cut stump and then move on to its neighboring healthy trees. I do not know of any place in Washington state doing this, but it has been done in this country before. So what do we do when we have root rots on our property? The first thing and the most important thing, in my opinion, is to sort of survey your land and know what you have and where. And hopefully, after what I just talked to you, you at least have a stepping stone to get that knowledge. You then have some decisions about what you want to do with your root rot disease on your property. And the main thing most people do is they try to manipulate their tree species. In other words, if you think back to that chart that I showed you initially, you'll remember that different root rot diseases prefer different tree species. So if we start to encourage tree species that root rot does not like, then we can start to encourage these tolerant or resistant species there and reduce the level of root rot in that area. And this is certainly the method for root rot management that is done the most. There are a couple other things that you can do if you strongly don't want root rot disease on your property. You can try to minimize the disease spread, and that's what's being shown in this picture to the right, where you manage the trees that aren't the ones that are symptomatic, but also the healthy trees that are in a large buffer around your root rot pocket, and try to minimize the capability of that pathogen to spread from root to root to root. This is often easier said and shown on a diagram than done out in the field, but there are places in Washington where this has been attempted. And then the other aggressive management technique we can do is we can try to minimize the soil inoculum. And this is where you're trying to pull out any of that susceptible host material, the tree roots and stumps in the area, to remove the pathogen from the ground. This is expensive and disturbs the soil a lot, so it's rarely done, but it has been done in specific areas in Washington before. And of course, your final option is to do nothing and know that these root rots are a native part of our forest. However, if you do nothing, please know that do not ignore their presence and work them into your management plans. For example, root rot infected trees are a higher hazard and are more likely to fall over, so avoid building anything or putting anything that would encourage people or structures in the area of a root rot pocket. So that's all I'm going to talk about with root rots, and I'll point you towards some resources at the end of this talk where you can learn more and go from there if you think this is something that's happening on your property or something you want to learn more about. Okay, next we'll talk about bark beetles. Bark beetles are tiny beetles that are pretty hard to see, but they certainly get a lot of attention. And in the right circumstances, they really can cause a lot of damage. So bark beetles, like all beetles, go through 4 life stages: the egg, the larva, the pupa, and the adult. Bark beetles usually take 1 year to complete this cycle, though there are some that take longer, depending on the species. And like their name indicates, bark beetles spend most of their life between the bark and the sapwood of a tree. So the egg, larva, and pupa never see the daylight. They're always living between the bark and the sapwood. And it's only those adult beetles that tunnel out of the tree, merge, fly to a new tree, tunnel into that tree to mate and lay eggs there. So you can imagine if bark beetles are living between the bark and the sapwood, in large numbers, they can do a lot of damage to trees. So here are some pictures of their tunnels, also commonly called galleries, that have been etched on either the inside of the bark or on the sapwood of trees. In addition to that, on the right-hand side, you'll also see a picture of staining in a cross-section of a tree. And bark beetles often also introduce staining fungi when they attack trees. And the staining fungi discolors the wood and can impact timber values if you're trying to salvage some trees that have been impacted by bark beetles. But what is their actual impact here in Western Washington? Well, the most important thing to remember is that at low population levels in sort of the normal world, bark beetles generally only are capable of successfully attacking weakened or even just freshly killed trees. And so therefore they're considered secondary. They may go after trees that have had storm or fire damage, and those are the only ones that they can impact. And so therefore, when we think about bark beetles in most scenarios, you don't want to think that the beetles have led to the dead tree, but instead you want to think about the dead and dying tree has attracted the beetles. So opposite of how we often think about these. And therefore, if you're looking closely at a dead tree, you often see those tunnels and galleries because those dead trees like to attract those, dead and dying trees like to attract those beetles. So keep that in mind. And the reason why this is that a healthy tree is usually protected. It has high pitch pressure and lots of resin. And so if a beetle was to tunnel in through its bark, the tree is able to flush it out and the beetle can't successfully live within the tree. Now, there are scenarios where beetle populations can build up, and this happens when there's lots of stressed trees. So if you have a storm that goes through and all of a sudden you have a lot of easy food for these beetles, within a year when they complete their next population cycle, it's possible that there's large numbers of beetles present. And when there's large number of beetles, they communicate through pheromones and they can coordinate with each other. And in large numbers, they can successfully attack and kill healthy trees. So you can imagine even a healthy tree, if attacked enough times, loses its high pitch pressure and its resin reserves. And in that scenario, it becomes a primary pest and can kill healthy trees. So what does it look like at sort of a stand level if this is happening? Well, just like root rots, you'll notice that the mortality is clustered together, where the beetle population is very high. However, you will notice that the impacted trees are all having a similar diameter and are all of the same species. And that's because beetles have a preference for diameter size of trees and also species. And also unique, bark beetles kill trees really rapidly. So in just a few months, you'll notice the trees going from green to red. And those trees will have retained all of their foliage because they have been killed so rapidly. If you're seeing things that make you think of bark beetles, you then want to look closer at individual trees. And depending on the species of bark beetle and the tree, you'll see a variety of different things. The first thing you may notice is pitch streaming. This is the tree trying to flush out the beetles that have attacked it. And so each one of these little streams is coming from a beetle entry tunnel. And you definitely, if you're seeing pitch streaming, want to pay attention to where that pitch is coming from, because especially Douglas fir will do this even if you just have some mechanical damage up above not caused by beetles. Similarly, you might also see pitch tubes. These are just less streamy, and depending on the species of tree, will also be around the entry hole of the beetle, trying to protect itself from attack. Once the beetles are successfully in the tree, you may see born dust that the beetles have pushed out of their tunnels. This builds up on the bark of the tree and can often be easier to see. You notice I have nowhere on here the actual entry tunnels themselves, the little bore holes, because I find those are too hard to find and see on tree bark, but they are there if you look closely. Next, you might see pouch fungus. This is the fungus Cryptoporus vulvatus. This fungus is introduced to the tree often with bark beetles, and once the bark beetles have fed on the tree and killed the tree and they leave, the fungus emerges from the entry holes and produces its fruiting structure. So if you see pouch fungus, the tree likely had bark beetles, but they've been long gone. And then just a reminder, you often see red crowns because these trees die quickly and they usually retain all of their needles. And then lastly, and most importantly, when you peel back the bark of trees, you often see these galleries or the tunnels that the beetles have left behind. And this is often what we look for in the field, especially when you're dealing with dead trees that no one minds if you peel back their bark. So if you're seeing these things in the field, how do you identify which bark beetle is impacting your trees? Well, remember, bark beetles have a preference for tree species and tree size. So make note of both species and tree size, and then spend some time looking at that gallery or tunnel pattern between the bark and the sapwood, because different types of beetles make different patterns. And though, yes, you can come across adult beetles, and if you happen to know an entomologist with a microscope, they can tell you what species of bark beetle it is. Often all you need to know is the species of tree impacted, the size of tree impacted, and have a sense of their gallery pattern. And this image here is from one of the field guides I'll point you towards at the end of this talk. So what is actually happening with bark beetles in Washington? This slide is taken from a conversation I had with our entomologist here at DNR, Glenn Kohler. And he summarized the entire state, but the important thing to think about for Western Washington is we're mainly seeing Douglas fir beetle over here, and often with increases related to fire and storm damage. So here's an image here about the number of acres that have been estimated to be impacted by Douglas fir beetle in the past 10 years. And you can see a general increase in their numbers over the past decade. Additionally, though not super relevant to Western Washington, there are increases in other bark beetles related to drought and sand density issues, mainly seen on the east side. So I've listed them here if anyone is curious. So since Douglas fir beetle is what you will most likely find in Western Washington, just some specific examples of Douglas fir beetle. You'll often notice that boring dust or the pitch streaming from Douglas fir. This beetle attacks larger Douglas fir, so it will only be on the larger diameter trees. You'll see this. And then oftentimes that pouch fungus, here's a picture of the pouch fungus from afar. You can see that without even getting close to the tree, and you probably have a good guess of that there were Douglas fir beetles in those trees that have killed the trees and then have since left. And then, of course, you can get used to the gallery pattern of Douglas fir beetle that's best seen by some of the diagrams in the resources I'll point you towards at the end. So if you have bark beetles, what can you do? Or if you're concerned about bark beetles, what can you do? Well, the main thing you want to do is to maintain your tree vigor and reduce its stress. That's because a healthy tree can often protect itself from the normal levels of bark beetles and can make it so bark beetle populations can't build up. The main way to do this in forests is often to thin, to keep individual trees more resources so that they're not as stressed by competing within each other. The next thing you want to do is keep your eye out for large inputs of freshly dead trees. If you're specifically concerned about Douglas fir beetle, then you'll want to keep an eye out for just the larger diameter trees that have, say, been recently killed by a storm, and manage those before bark beetle populations can build up over the next year with their life cycle. And lastly, there are pesticides out there that do protect against bark beetles. They typically mimic pheromones, such as the MCH anti-aggregation pheromone package shown in this picture here, which basically tricks the beetle into thinking that they're getting, they're being communicated by other beetles to say, don't come to this tree, it's not a good tree to attack. Now, this helps protect trees. It doesn't cure trees that are already impacted by bark beetles, and it tends to be expensive. So it typically is only used in high value situations with specific trees that individuals are worried about. Okay, so that's a little bit of information about bark beetles that can hopefully get you started about learning more. I want to end by talking a little bit about heat. I'm sure that we have all been thinking a lot about heat in this past year, ever since that heat dome effect. And pretty quickly after that heat dome effect, that event was connected to climate change, human-caused climate change, which really drives home the point to us foresters that we need to be expecting increasing temperatures in Washington in the future. So one thing we did notice right after the heat dome event is we did see a lot of heat scorch on trees, and depending on where you lived in Washington state, you might have also seen this. And what happens in heat scorch is you have that dry, sunny heat that desiccates the foliage very rapidly. And you'll see the desiccation as dead brown needles pretty quickly after the event. And they're often on the side of the tree that was exposed to the hottest temperatures during the day. So when the sun was sort of on the southwest side of the tree, that's where you will see the impact. And we saw this especially in areas that were open, so in trees that were more exposed to the sun, on trees that were on western facing aspects, and any trees and any tree species could be impacted. So it wasn't just a single tree species being impacted. In addition to this, we also had a very droughty 2021. Here is a graph from drought.gov that shows the percentage of Washington state that is in one category of drought over the course of the past 10 years, with darker colors indicating higher levels of drought. And I've indicated on this slide 2015, which was a very drought prevalent year for Washington, and also 2021 last year. And the thing to keep in mind here is that we are somewhat lucky in Washington in the fact that our trees have evolved with mild summer droughts. They're used to not getting water for some summer months. However, these extreme months are certainly something new to our forests and are something that can impact them significantly. So what do you see on a tree that's been impacted by drought injury? Well, what you'll see is that there's top down and outside in injury. So the opposite of what we talked about with root rots. With this injury might look like wilting or needle drop or branch dieback. And again, this is the abiotic disease agent, which means that often many tree species are impacted and not just a single tree species. So you often see impact on numerous tree species. You'll also notice that this impact is worse on marginal sites. In other words, often found in urban areas, and it's worse in areas with well-draining soils, so those with lots of sand content. The one frustrating thing about drought injury is it doesn't always happen or display itself during the drought itself. It can be delayed. Now, sometimes the drought is extreme enough that you will notice the injury during the drought, but other times you won't notice it right away. And so with our future in Washington, including both heat and drought, what does that mean for our trees? Well, here's a picture of a typical water cycle on a tree where you have water falling as precipitation to the ground, being absorbed through the roots, being transported through the tree xylem to the foliage, where it's then transpirated out into the atmosphere again. And in a sort of a typical water cycle, the amount of water being pulled into the tree is roughly equivalent to the amount of water that's leaving the tree. However, when we add heat and drought into this scenario, you have some things that are changed. First thing, with heat, warm air can better hold water, so it is much more efficient at pulling water out from a tree. So that increases transpiration rates in a tree. Now, trees do have abilities to minimize this. Again, they have evolved with drought, some level of drought, so they can close their stomates and minimize the water loss. However, they can only do that for so long and up to a certain point. So often with these extreme heats, we do have increased levels of transpiration. And obviously with droughts, we have less water falling on the ground, which means less water in the soil for the tree to absorb, which means that our xylem transport, the amount of water the tree wants to pull up to release, gets impacted with this like sort of 1-2 punch on both sides. And this can lead to rapid hydraulic failure, which you see the top dieback or full tree death, or it can have longer term problems with carbon starvation and mobilization with the tree, and can impact the tree for a long time down the road. So what can we do about this drought and heat management? Well, the first thing we can do is to consider the right tree in the right site. And so here's a picture of a seed zone map from the Washington State Department of Natural Resources that indicates the location of where certain trees, in this case, Douglas fir trees, where their seed source was harvested. And in general, you want to plant trees that are local because they'll be adapted to your environment. So stay within your seed zone. If you were to take some Douglas fir seeds from the eastern side of Washington and move them to the western side, those trees are not used to our climate here and would certainly struggle much more than a local seed source. Now, I've been talking about climate change, so people do like to ask, well, should I be changing seed sources to better predict what the future will be? You know, there's not a lot of research done on this yet, so I can't confidently say, but anecdotally, we are seeing small changes not being as risky as large changes, and that moving east or west or down in elevation appears to be riskier than moving north or south or slightly up in elevation when looking at seed zones. But again, we certainly don't recommend huge changes because whatever tree you're planting today needs to survive in today's climate, not just in the future climates. Okay, and then the other thing you can consider is thinning overstocked areas. Again, this sort of gives the few water resources that are present to a few trees versus spreading them thin throughout many trees, and can help your trees survive droughts a little better. Okay, so those were the main three things I wanted to talk about, but I do want to say that's not all that we're seeing in Washington State. We do a lot of work with a lot of different diseases and pests in the area, so I just want to mention a few so you're not so focused on just the three I talked about. We've been doing a lot of work with white pine blister rust this past year. This is a non-native fungal disease that impacts white pines. We also do yearly trapping of Douglas fir tussock moths. On the east side, they're not really a problem here on the west side. We also trap water bodies for Phytophthora vermorum. This is the causal agent of sudden oak death that's impacting tan oaks and oaks in California and Oregon, but not impacting our forest here in Washington yet. We do work with Swiss needlecast, which I mentioned earlier on, just sort of keeping an eye on what it's doing along our coasts. And this past year, I do want to mention we saw parch blight, which is another needle desiccation that's different than heat scorch that I mentioned. This happens earlier in the year, in late winter, early spring, with cold winds that are dry being blown from the east side over our Cascade passes. And you'll see those red needles form on the eastern side of trees earlier on in the year before bud break. So a little different, but is something that you might have seen this past year. And then lastly, we have been noticing a new emerging disease, sooty bark disease. And if you sign on to a later talk given by Joey, you'll learn a lot more about the disease that is we're finding a lot in Western Washington. So just a shout out for a future talk. And then I want to end by just pointing out that despite talking about a lot of scenarios, a lot of the overall management decisions and goals are the same. Just no matter what you have on your property. And your main goal is to think about how resilient is your forest. And the main way to achieve resiliency is to think about your forest diversity. And this is not only different species of trees being diverse in your forest, but also different ages and densities of trees. And the diversity helps because different disturbance agents impact different species and different age trees and different structural of forest differently. So the diversity you have in your forest can help make it more resilient. And then also you want to think about a resilient forest as vigorous trees. So do anything you can to make your trees less stressed. So think about the right tree on the right site, thinning overstocked areas, and doing your best to minimize any at least human stresses that are happening on trees, especially around any areas where construction is happening. And then I do want to remind everyone that nothing in a forest is static. We come across this a lot when we go out to landowners, help them, that if your current goal in your forest is to keep it exactly how it is today forever, you will not succeed. Forests grow, trees die, things change out your window. So please keep that in mind as you spend time in forests and as the forests age. So ending with some resources, and I'm going to paste these into the chat. The first thing I want to point you towards is a couple of updated resources that we update every year to see what's happening in Western Washington. The first is our annual Forest Health Highlights report. And the 2021 report should be available in the next month or so online, just an update of what we've seen. And then our annual aerial detection survey data. This flight is flown every year, and you can sort of get a sense of what's we're seeing at a bird's eye level in the Washington forest. It's always more accurate to see what's on the ground, but this sort of gives you a rough sense of what may be happening. And then for learning more about how to identify diseases and insects on conifers, I point you towards this first resource that you can get online that includes the tables and diagrams I showed earlier in this talk. So if you want to learn more just about what you're seeing, start there. And then if you want to get deeper into the management options, highly recommend the Managing Insects and Diseases of Oregon Conifers, also free online as a PDF. It is specifically written for Oregon, but I've read it. It applies to Washington and is very easy to read, and I highly recommend it. And with that, here's my contact information. I don't know how much time I have for questions, but if I don't get to them, shoot me an email and I'll be happy to touch base.